Hi there, Chris here, and welcome to week 1 of my Feel It in Your Bones Quilt-Along. Over the next 5 weeks, I will be releasing weekly videos going over each step to help you finish your quilt top. For week 1, we are just simply going to prep and cut our fabric. As we're cutting, I'm not going to be giving you all of the quantities and dimensions for each piece. You will need to go purchase the pattern for that, but I will give you some tips and tricks to help you be more successful with your cutting. To help you get started, here are the fabrics you're going to need for this quilt. I do have a few kits available at the time of recording this video, so I will link them in the video if you want to go pick one up, or you can use your own fabrics. For the background, we need 4 3/4 of a yard. For the tan or the bone color, we will need 1 1/4 yards. The white for the eyeballs is 1/2 yard, along with just a scrap of black for the pupils. It needs to be at least 1.5 inches by 18 inches. For the 5 skulls on the front of the quilt, you will need a fat quarter for each skull. They can all be the same color, or you can mix it up. You'll just need 5 fat quarters. For the binding, we need 3/4 of a yard. And then for the backing, you will need 5 yards of a standard width fabric, or 2.5 yards if you're using a white back. If you personally like to wash and press and starch your fabrics, you can go ahead and do that. I will be using them just straight off of the bolt. Pages 1 and 2 of the pattern have all of the cutting directions that you will need. We're going to start by cutting strips of fabric, width of fabric, and that means from selvage to selvage. As we're cutting all of our pieces, it is important to stay organized. I have my pieces all lettered in the pattern, so you'll have A, B, C, etc. There's lots of ways that you can label them. One of the easiest ways, though, is just with some painter's tape. So I'll use a permanent marker to write A, B, C, etc., and then place that tape on the top of the stack of that piece. My background fabric will be A through T, so I've written that on the tape, and then I will just use my rotary cutter to slice them apart. Nice and simple. For cutting our fabric today, we are just going to be using a 6-inch by 24-inch ruler and a standard rotary cutter. The way I like to cut my pieces is I will take the factory fold of my fabric and line it up on one of the lines of my cutting mat to make sure that it is perpendicular. And then you can use your ruler to square off one end. And if you have a problem holding the long ruler, you could put a hand weight at the end. That helps it so it's not scooting on you. So I'm just going to give you an example, cutting out the first piece here. With most of my patterns, I have you cut the largest pieces first. That way, if you make a cutting error, you can use that large piece to then subcut smaller pieces after recutting your large piece. Follow the pattern. Very first step says to cut 4 strips that are 14.5 inches by width of fabric. So you can count out 14.5 here, or you can just hold up your ruler. 14.5 is right here. So I'll use my mat and my ruler to line up the 1/2 inch mark. And before you cut, you can double check yourself. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 and a half. Once that's confirmed, I'll put my weight on the end so it doesn't slip on me. Cut. So there's 1. When you move your fabric, if this line does not perfectly fall on one of the lines of your mat, you can just square that up again. It is not uncommon. And you're really just shaving off a sliver. But that can really make a difference in your final quilt. Right, so another 14.5 piece right here. So now we have 2. 3. And 4. One thing to note as you're watching me cut. I am dominantly left-handed, but I will cut ambidextrously. I feel comfortable cutting with both hands. When you start to cut with a rotary cutter, do what feels most natural and comfortable for you so that you remain safe. If you're worried about getting cut, they also sell cut-proof gloves, typically in the kitchen section, that you can wear on your non-cutting hand, so if you slip, there's no injury. Now that we've cut our 4 14.5-inch strips, we need to sub-cut them. And what that means is we're going to take these cut pieces and cut them again. So when you see a pattern say sub-cut into X, that's what they're referring to. The factory fold is generally a pretty deep crease, so I am going to press those out before I move on, but I will also stack these up so that I can cut multiple layers at a time. As an example, from these 4 14.5-inch strips, I need to cut 4 18.5-inch chunks, 4 14.5-inch chunks, and 10 2.5-inch strips. So I'm going to start with the largest piece. I will stack up my 4 layers of fabric and cut 4 18.5-inch pieces, then move down, cut my 14.5-inch pieces, and then with what's left, I will cut my 2.5-inch strips. So I have my layers all stacked up. And I'm going to chop off this selvage edge here. Get that lined up with my mat. Now we will cut 18.5 inches. And these are piece T. So I will take that sticker, put it on the stack. Since these are so large, I will fold them up and set them aside. Then we will just move on to our next cut. This is piece S. And then for smaller cuts that fit within my 6 inches here, I like to use the ruler. So I will find the 2.5-inch mark, line that up with the edge. And if you go a little crooked on your mat, it's actually going to help your mat wear better because you won't be continually cutting on the straight lines. That makes 4. That makes 8. And now I only need 10. So I'm going to remove 2 layers and then cut the remaining 2 strips. So that gives me 10 2.5 by 14.5-inch strips. These are piece H. Now with these extra offcuts, what I will do is I will just start making a pile. This is really good to have handy in case you make a cutting error and you need a piece that can fit within this. After the project's fully completed, I will take these and put them into my scrap bins for a future project. Okay, I'm just going to move along and finish cutting out the rest of this quilt. Now, before I move on to the next fabric, I'm going to take an inventory of everything I just cut to make sure I have what I need. On my pattern, I included this table here, so it'll show you of piece A, you need this amount, piece B, you need this amount, so that when it's all said and done, before you start sewing, you know you have all the correct pieces. So I'm going to go through and count everything I just cut, make sure I didn't miss anything. All right, all of my background pieces are cut and accounted for. I am going to take a break for lunch. That took me about 1 hour and 45 minutes to get that all cut. So as you're going through this, give yourself time. Don't try to rush through it. It's better to have them cut right the first time than to run out of fabric. So I'll be right back to finish up the rest of the colors. All right, moving right along, we're going to cut our tan fabric. This is for the bones on the front of the quilt. So the same thing, we're going to cut width of fabric strips and then subcut those into the pieces we need. And now we get to move on to cutting the fat quarters for our skulls. Now each one of these will be cut differently, so we'll take them one at a time. Up first is Love. This is Lake Natron from my Damask Fatal line. When cutting your fat quarters, you're going to want to find the factory edge or the selvage, because we need to cut our strips parallel to that so that we have enough to cut for the skull. So I'll take my factory edge and put it on the right hand side. Since I am left-handed, I'll be working from left to right. All right, so something to note when subcutting from the fat quarters, there is one piece, and it's piece 6, so it's labeled as L6, G6, D6, etc., that you're going to make 2 cuts to get it to the size. So it's being cut from our 3.5-inch strip, but the piece is only 2.5 inches wide. So you can subcut this strip down to 2.5 inches, and then from this piece, cut your 8.5-inch length. Just like that. Up next is Gloom in my kit that is Yeti from my Damask Fatal line. This is a special edition for the kit only. Up next is Doom, and for the kit we are using Damask Fatal Bleeding Heart. Next up is Fear, and in the kit we'll be using Damask Fatal Sulfur. The last skull we're going to cut is Happy, and in the kit that is Damask Fatal Envious. Now the very last thing we need to cut is our binding. To bind this quilt, we will need to cut 9 2.5-inch strips by width of fabric. We now have everything cut out for the Feel It in Your Bones quilt. So for this week, just go through, get everything cut and labeled, and find a good place where you can stay organized and lay out all the pieces. I have them laid out on a quilt laying over my long arm behind me. That's going to help us as we go to assemble the blocks, knowing where all of the pieces are so we don't have to go digging. Be sure to submit your progress photos via the Google form so that I can include them in this week's recap. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. See you next week.